We've got some solid starter UI in place, and we're ready to put some data in there. So let's take a minute to think about the kind of data we want to keep in this app. README is meant to be a digital catalog for all of our personal physical libraries, and the basic building block of a library is the book. So here are the properties I'm planning to keep track of in this app. But I think to start, let's just do 3: a title, author, and image. Let's make a custom book type to hold those properties. We should put our new book type in its own file, so Command-N to make a new file. Select Swift, name it Book, and save it. At the top, import UIKit. We'll need that in a minute. And then start a book struct. Now we can add the properties I talked about earlier, title and author properties, both strings. And an image property of type UIImage. Now these are fairly universal properties of many book-like things. I am not going to tell you what counts as a book. It's your library. If that means comic books or magazines or Dungeons & Dragons monster manuals, I am excited for you. And if you want to up the challenge for this course a little, customize the data model for yourself as we go. Okay, we've got an empty table view and a prototype cell and a book type to model books with. How do we take all of that and give our table view some data to display? This is where we'll get into the code. Each table view in your app is an instance of a UITableView class. A table view has a lot of properties, but only one essential property that you must set for it to do anything: the data source. So what is a data source? You might guess from the name that it's the source of a table view's data. It can act as a place to store data, but its real job is to be a sort of data middle manager. A data source doesn't have a special type. It can be anything that can conform to the UITableViewDataSource protocol. A TableViews data source tells the table view things like how many rows it needs and how many sections those rows should be split into. The data source also manages copies of your prototype cells, configures them with your data, and hands them off to the table view to fill each row. Again, this is a protocol, so our data source needs to meet the requirements of the protocol to get all that cool functionality. There are 2 required methods that you'll need to implement. Like most of the methods in this protocol, both of them start with TableView, and then the first parameter doesn't have an argument label, and then you have a really long second argument label that actually describes what the method does. And you may wonder, how do I say methods like this? If you're already talking about a table view, just refer to it by the second argument name, maybe that argument name and the parameter name. So, method number 1 is number of rows in section. This is the one that tells the table view how many total things it needs to plan to display for each section. If you have 50 books in one section, you'd return 50. Method number 2 is cell for row at, or cell for row at index path. This method is in charge of setting up the cells. That's a little more complicated than it might sound, so we'll come back to it. First, let's set up a data source. Often, if you have a simple table view, the view controller housing it can act as its data source. Actually, because we started out with a table view controller instead of a regular view controller, the data source is already set up that way. You can see for yourself if you select the table view and look at the connections inspector. The data source property is connected to the table view controller. Excellent. Now we need a table view controller class for our code. Open up viewcontroller.swift and change UI view controller to UI table view controller. And let's update the name of this class. Option click on view controller, go to refactor and rename. Change it to library view controller and hit return. And while we're doing this, just jump back to Interface Builder and set the class for your table view controller to library view controller. Great. Back to the code. Now, just like the data source property was already connected, TableView controllers are also already set up to adopt the UITableViewDataSource protocol. So at this point, we need to override the 2 methods I talked about. If you start typing number of rows, you should be able to autocomplete the rest. And then do the same for cell for row at. And put a mark comment above to help keep our code tidy. All right. number of rows in section, is where we tell the table view how many things it will need to make rows for. To get something happening, we can just return any int, like 50 rows. Implementing the next method, cell4row@indexPath, is a little more complicated, so it's time to learn about dequeuing.